Hi U3AOS. In this video we're going to go through the concepts behind genetic engineering. So the key knowledge behind this video is the use of genetically modified and transgenic organisms in agriculture to increase crop productivity and to provide resistance to disease. So the key words there would be genetically modified versus transgenic organisms, and we're going to go through that, as well as crop productivity and resistance to disease. So how are we changing the genome of these crops to do these two things, increasing productivity and resisting disease? So you'll be successful in this lesson if you can compare and contrast those terms, genetically modified organisms, so GMOs, and transgenic organisms, TGOs. You'll be able to describe examples of both of them, as well as take examples and categorize them as either GMOs or TGOs. And you'll also obviously be able to list examples of GMOs in agriculture. So let's start with some terminology. Definitely these must be in your glossary. If you don't have a glossary, you need to make sure that you start one ASAP. Use Quizlet. It's awesome. You can use it to quiz yourself. So a genetically modified organism is an organism that has its DNA altered in some way. A transgenic organism is an organism that contains a gene from other species. So we can modify the DNA of an organism by knocking out a gene, so taking a gene out, maybe inducing a mutation in a particular gene, increasing the frequency of a gene in its genome, lots of different ways that we can modify an organism's genome. We can also add in a gene from a different species. So if we add in a gene from a different species, that's when we call it a transgenic organism. By definition, a transgenic organism is also a GMO. So if they're transgenic, they've had their DNA modified, so they're also a GMO. But just because they're a genetically modified organism, so just because they're a GMO, doesn't mean they're transgenic. So an example of a GMO that isn't a transgenic organism would perhaps be knockout mice. So mice that we've had have genes disrupted by the insertion of a synthetic piece of DNA. So that gene no longer functions. So we've deliberately gone in and knocked a specific gene out. And that's really common in medical research. An example of a GMO that is a transgenic organism is perhaps a bacteria cell with a human gene inserted into it. So something that is part of our study design is the study of when we insert the insulin gene into bacteria. So that would be the human insulin gene. So that would be a transgenic organism because there's a human gene in a bacteria. It's also a GMO because we've modified its genome. So let's have a go at practicing this. So we've got a glowfish. A glowfish is a zebrafish that has incorporated genes from the sea anemone, and it causes them to glow beautiful bright colors. Is that a GMO, a TGO, or both? Excellent. It is both. It's had its genes modified, and that's been modified by adding a gene from a different species into it. So therefore, it's also a TGO, a transgenic organism. Let's have another go. We've got flavor saver tomatoes. So this is a new, I guess, situation which we need to get used to approaching. So an early use of RNAi technology, which is the type of RNA that interrupts synthesis of proteins. So if you have a look up here, this is the, I guess, a chromosome. That whole thing is a chromosome from a tomato. What happens normally is that gene gets transcribed into mRNA, and then it gets translated into a particular enzyme here that causes the tomato cells to age or to rot. It breaks down peptin, this enzyme. If we insert a little piece of RNA that's complementary to the mRNA that's produced, it makes it inaccessible for the ribosomes to be able to translate the protein. If we don't have that protein, then tomatoes can't produce the enzyme that breaks down peptin, therefore it rots much slower, or it doesn't rot. So the sense of the flavor saver, we're saving the flavor for longer because the tomato is staying good for longer because it's not able to create that protein. Do you think that is a GMO, a TGO, or both? Fabulous. The GMO is a synthetic antisense version of that gene. So we're not putting in a gene from another organism. We're just chucking in different types of nucleotides, a synthetic piece of RNA that's stopping that messenger RNA from being translated into a protein. Some more examples of genetic engineering in agriculture. A reminder of the key knowledge point that we need to understand how GMOs are used to increase crop productivity as well as provide resistance to disease. So this is an example of increased crop productivity. These Roundup Ready canola basically synthesize a protein that makes them resistant to Roundup or glyphosate. Therefore, you could spray these crops with glyphosate, all of the weeds around them would die, but this particular crop would not die. And I want you to have a think about, that's awesome because we can kill the weeds, we can maintain the things that are disrupting the growing environment for that plant. But think about what perhaps might be the negative impacts or ethical considerations associated with using Roundup Ready crops in agriculture. What impact could that have on, that product itself, but also on the surrounding ecosystem? So GMOs are awesome. They allow us to do things like, as I said, create pest resistant or increase yield crops. But there are issues associated with them. So I'll let you have a read through these issues here. But a lot of them are quite valid. Some of them are, I guess it depends on your opinion as well. So the biggest one, which you can't see because it's under my head here, is the loss of genetic diversity. So if we're modifying genomes to create crops that do exactly what we want them to do, it means we've got this big monoculture. And so you've got this monoculture full of produce and plants that are all genetically identical. So if we're reducing the genetic diversity of that crop, it means that they're less likely to respond to changes in the environment, which, as we know from year 11, isn't good. It means that, you have one change and the whole crop gets wiped out. So you should have a nice summary in your books of some of the ethical issues with GMO, and we'll explore these as well as other examples of GMOs in agriculture in class this week.